Welcome to the Africa Briefing Room, where we break down the big stories shaping the continent. Today, we're diving into a topic that's making headlines and shaking up lives on both sides of the Atlantic: Donald Trump's proposed tariffs. Who would they really hurt? Recently, the prospect of a new wave of so-called reciprocal tariffs from the Trump administration has sparked debate. But here's the thing: these proposed tariffs aren't the result of careful strategy. They're more like scattershot acts of ideology, rooted in the belief that tariffs are a silver bullet for quote-unquote bad deals. In reality, they would punish allies, disrupt global supply chains, and, as we'll see, hurt everyday people. But beneath the noise, something deeper is unfolding. The very rules of globalization are being contested, and Africa, often positioned as a bystander in great power disputes, stands on the threshold of redefining its role. Could the threat of these external shocks be the catalyst for Africa to set its own terms in a reset world order? That's what we're exploring today. Tariffs are no longer just an economic policy. They've become a high-stakes tool for countries to gain power and control their own destinies. And how Africa responds right now could redefine trade and global influence for years to come. Let's step back to where this all began. Tariffs have always been pitched, especially by the Trump administration, as a quick fix to rebalance trade and protect American jobs. But when the US tried to flex its muscle over Africa during his first term, the logic quickly unraveled. Take the case of Rwanda. In 2017, Rwanda made a strategic decision to restrict imports of second-hand clothing. This wasn't an act of hostility, it was a move to nurture local industry, create jobs, and chart its own economic destiny. But that show of sovereignty was swiftly met with punishment. The Trump White House threatened to remove Rwanda's trade benefits under the African Growth and Opportunity Act, better known as AGOA. By July 2018, Rwanda's duty-free access for apparel was gone. This set a precedent. Instead of respecting African nations' right to set their own course, Washington saw this self-determination as a threat. Tariffs moved beyond economics. They became diplomatic weapons, signaling that asserting African priorities would come at a cost. Fast forward to today, Donald Trump has proposed a sweeping new round of tariffs that would target dozens of countries, with Africa poised to take the hardest hit yet. If enacted, these tariffs would mark a major escalation in global trade tensions. From Lesotho's textile factories to South Africa's steel plants, tens of thousands of jobs would hang in the balance. Factories would suddenly face steep losses in export markets. National budgets would be stretched thin, as countries would scramble to respond to economic emergencies. Tens of thousands of jobs would be at risk, not because of local policy failure, but due to distant decisions made abroad. Under these proposals, South Africa would face unprecedented pressure. While South Africa anticipates up to 30,000 jobs at risk from newly imposed US tariffs, as high as 30%, it's worth noting that key sectors, such as critical minerals and pharmaceuticals, are partially insulated by exemptions. In Lesotho, the textile industry has been rocked by a recently reduced, but still damaging 15% tariff, prompting a state of national disaster and putting tens of thousands of jobs in jeopardy. Kenya's 10% tariff, though lower than some neighbors, threatens critical export sectors, just as uncertainty over the African Growth and Opportunity Act renewal mounts. The result? Rising inflation, currency depreciation, and a wave of uncertainty that's forcing African governments to scramble for solutions. For many, the challenge is not just how to weather this storm, but how to chart a new course in a world where old trade certainties are fast disappearing. So, what's the logic behind these proposed tariffs? The Trump campaign frames them as a way to put America first, protecting American jobs and bringing manufacturing back home. But here's the reality: such tariffs would mostly just raise costs for American producers, especially in industries like cars and electronics that rely on global supply chains. US factories wouldn't be able to produce everything themselves overnight. They need those global supply chains to stay competitive. And when production costs go up, those higher prices get passed on to American consumers. So, even if a few jobs came back, they would likely be outweighed by job losses elsewhere and by families paying more for everyday goods. Recent research puts a hard number on those household costs. Analysts estimate that the proposed universal tariff could increase costs for the average US household by over an estimated $1,400 per year, with global retaliation threatening hundreds of billions in US exports. It should also be noted that many of the manufacturing jobs that left the US did so because of cheaper labor abroad. Companies moved production overseas to cut costs, not because of unfair trade deals, but because wages and operating expenses were simply lower elsewhere. Even if tariffs succeeded in bringing some of these jobs back, there's no guarantee they'll pay enough to match today's cost of living in the US. This is why most economists agree tariffs aren't a magic bullet. They're just a tax on Americans, without solving the real economic challenges workers face today. But there's more. These proposals wouldn't just hit American wallets, they would disrupt global supply chains, making US products less competitive. And when the US imposes tariffs, other countries retaliate. That means American exporters, especially farmers and manufacturers, would face new barriers overseas, shrinking their markets and threatening jobs. There's also the African Growth and Opportunity Act factor, which was designed to foster goodwill and economic ties. Now, with the threat of new tariffs and the real risk that AGOA won't be renewed, decades of progress are at risk. If AGOA is not renewed, which is set to expire in September 2025, all those goods that once entered the US duty-free will suddenly face tariffs, dealing a major blow to African economies and undermining US influence on the continent. Lastly, all this uncertainty, the threat of new tariffs, the questions around trade agreements, makes it harder for businesses to plan and invest. That slows growth, stifles innovation, and leaves both American and African workers in limbo. The bottom line is that tariffs are sold as a fix for bad deals, but in practice, they would be a blunt instrument that hurts trading partners, raises costs, and fails to deliver the promised jobs. But here's where things get interesting. As the threat of tariffs and protectionist policies looms over African economies, the continent has a chance, not just to defend itself, but to redefine its role in global trade. First, by upholding sovereignty, like Rwanda did, African countries can stimulate local industries and create jobs, even if it means short-term pain. If more countries follow suit, it could inspire a wave of self-reliance and reduce dependence on external markets. Second, by deepening intra-African trade through the African Continental Free Trade Area, or AFCFTA. Right now, approximately 15 to 18% of African trade is within the continent, compared to 69% in Europe. But with 47 countries signed on, intra-African trade hit $220 billion in 2024 and could nearly triple to about $560 billion by 2035 if fully implemented. That means greater resilience and potentially up to 18 million new jobs in a best-case scenario, while as many as 30 million African could be lifted out of economic hardship. However, these gains depend on comprehensive reforms that go beyond reducing tariffs. Third, by expanding South-to-South partnerships. With China, Brazil, India, and others, Africa can open new markets and sources of investment. China-Africa trade, for example, has surged from roughly $12 billion in 2002 to a record $282 billion in 2023. Yet despite this growth, the relationship is marked by a persistent trade deficit for Africa, which mostly exports raw materials in exchange for manufactured goods. But there's a catch. To make these shifts work, African leaders need to build trust with their citizens. That means honest conversations about short-term sacrifices, like higher prices or job losses, and a clear vision for long-term gains. Because resilience isn't just built on trade agreements, it's built on trust. So, are Trump's tariffs the economic masterstroke they were promised to be? Not even close. While these tariffs will deal an immediate blow to African economies, threatening jobs, growth, and stability across the continent, the ripple effects won't stop there. As supply chains are disrupted and costs rise, it's American consumers who will ultimately pay the price, facing higher prices for everyday goods and fewer choices at home. In the end, these policies expose a deep misunderstanding of how global trade really works. But here's what's still in play. Africa has a window, not just to recover, but to rise. By investing in regional trade, doubling down on sovereignty, and deepening ties with the global South, African nations could reshape global trade and shift leverage away from reactive populist powers. And if that happens, the real pressure could flip. The US economy, especially its consumers, could start to feel the consequences. Fewer accessible markets, higher prices, and less influence in a world where supply chains no longer depend on Washington's favor. The real question isn't whether Africa can survive without Western approval, it's whether the West can thrive without African partnership. The answer to that will shape the global economy for decades to come.